My name is Claudia Valegia. I am the faculty chair of the Council on Latin American and Iberian Studies. Bienvenidos, bienvenidas. My accent is from Argentina. And I'm also a professor in anthropology, working with indigenous communities in northern Argentina. I am so excited to welcome you to our kickoff event, which is the first hybrid event of our semester. And it features these career communications, career conversations that we are having with Latin American Studies fellows, in this case featuring alumni like Liz. And we are very excited to have the opportunity to have people, in this case, we don't have many online, but welcome the in-person component as well. Here at CLISE, we really strive to be the place, the hub for intellectual exchange and collaboration and partnerships so that we can strengthen the understanding of Latin American and Iberian Peninsula countries. And we really are very happy to have been able to form networks of collaboration and celebration of Latin American and Iberian cultures here. We are also the very proud home of the Latin American Studies major. And in case you have not yet signed up for our undergraduate or graduate networks, please check out our website. You have all the links there to join the respective networks. And I am very happy to pass the baton to Professor De La O, who's the DUS, the Director of Undergraduate Studies of the Latin American Studies major, who will introduce then our brilliant speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. Hi, everyone. My name is Ana De La O. I am an associate professor in the political science department. And as Claudia mentioned, I am the director of undergraduate studies for the Latin American Studies major. And I'm happy to talk to you about the major if you want after this event. So I will stay here a while to discuss the major with you if you're interested. And today is my great honor to be here introducing our speaker for today, Elizabeth Jordan. Elizabeth, welcome back again, if only virtually.
Thank you.
Elizabeth has a pretty impressive curriculum, and I am just going to highlight a few of the wonderful achievements that she has made in her career. Her practice focuses on advancing human rights in the United States legal system through trauma-informed and cross-cultural representation of her clients. Liz has significant experience at the intersection of immigration law, disability law, and the criminal legal system, and has dedicated her career to working on the front lines of these issues, including through zealous representation of death sentence prisoners, immigrant children, and immigrants with disabilities that have been locked up by the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency. Currently, Liz serves as the inaugural director of the Immigration Detention Accountability Project, IDAP, at the Civil Rights Education and Enforcement Center, CRES, a project which she helped establish. IDAP seeks to protect the rights of detained immigrants through system change litigation, individual representation, technical assistance to immigration attorneys and advocates, and legal education at the intersection of immigration and disability justice. IDAP's work, just to give you an example of what they do, includes Freihard versus ICE, a nationwide class action lawsuit filed by the center, Disability Rights Advocates, Southern Poverty Law Center, the Oric, Harrington, and Sutcliffe LLP, and Wilkie Farr and Gallagher LLP. And Freihard challenges the federal government's failure to adequately monitor its detention system, as well as improper medical and mental health care, disability accommodations, and the unconstitutional use of segregation in ICE detention centers. A preliminary injunction won in that case has contributed to the release of over 3,000 detained immigrants with elevated risk factors for COVID-19. And before joining the center, Liz was a staff attorney at the Doors Legal Services Center in New York City. She was also a fellow with the Capital Appeals Project in Louisiana. And prior to law school, Liz spent a year as a Fulbright scholar in Spain studying human rights issues. And as we all know, Liz received her BA from here, Yale, and she graduated summa cum laude from New York University's School of Law. So we are very, very honored to have you with us here today, Liz. Thank you so much for joining this event.
Thank you for having me, and thank you, Professor de Rao, for that introduction. I thought, so to introduce myself once again, my name is Liz Jordan. I use she, her pronouns. I was a 2006 graduate of Yale College, and I was in Pearson College. My degree is a double major in political science and Latin American studies, and I currently live in Denver, where I'm a practicing attorney. My agenda for today, I thought I'd give you all a little more in-depth sort of discussion of my biography and my career path. And then I thought I'd share two perspectives that I think I really learned in the Latin American Studies major that I've been carrying with me in my career ever since. And so I'm going to try myself to about 20 minutes, and then I'm happy to answer as many questions as you all have. I grew up in Indiana. I went to public school in Indianapolis. My parents met overseas, and my dad is from a multi-generational military family that was actually stationed in Spain. Both my father and my grandfather were stationed in Spain. And my grandmother, a woman from Eastern Kentucky, made a really fierce paella that I grew up with in Indiana. But I actually did not have a passport even until I was about 16 years old. So I just want to give you that perspective as, you know, sort of where I was coming from when I arrived at Yale. I did have exceptional Spanish teachers in my high school in Indianapolis. So I arrived at Yale with a love for the music of Carlos Vives and exposure to Latin American arts and culture. So Spanish, I didn't just learn, you know, grammar. I learned a lot about the places where Spanish is spoken. When I arrived to Yale, I was, honestly overwhelmed. The number of courses that were available, all the different things that you could study that I, did not know about really. I started exploring different courses. A class that made an immediate impact on me was the art history survey that Professor Vincent Scully offered. I know that he's no longer with us, but that class was truly exceptional. I also immediately jumped into continuing my studies of Spanish. When I came to Yale, I was, like I said, kind of overwhelmed. I also had some self-doubt about whether I was really up for some of the studies at this university where I was coming from, but I felt confident in my ability to keep learning Spanish. And so I signed up for more Spanish classes sort of right away. And I ended up double majoring. I thought that Latin American studies was so interesting to me. Like I said, I was doing Spanish a lot. I signed up for literature classes in Spanish, but I also studied political science and in a lot of ways, sort of overlapped those two disciplines. Within Latin American studies, I took art history classes, I took literature classes in Spanish, and I took political science classes focusing on rights frameworks and how they applied in Latin America. So I remember very clearly, I wrote a paper on women's reproductive rights throughout the region. For one of my classes, I also studied the inclusion of indigenous rights in the Bolivian Constitution, which I think was the first in the region to include indigenous people in their constitution. And then with my summers, just to give everyone a sense of sort of what I spent my time with in my summers, my first summer after freshman year, I interned on Capitol Hill for one of the United States senators from Indiana. And then my second summer, I actually had a surgery and I spent the summer recovering from that. So I want to assure the undergrads that it's okay if you don't spend every summer doing something totally groundbreaking. I read a lot of books that summer and just recuperated. And then my third summer, with the support of the Council on Latin American Studies, I was fortunate to go to Havana, Cuba for 10 weeks, where I studied the way that civil society and especially religious institutions interacted with the Cuban Revolution. As folks may know, Fidel Castro and the Catholic Church had a very sort of on-again, off-again relationship for much of his time. I also studied the way the Protestant churches responded to the revolution. And so that's what I did with my summers. After I graduated from Yale, my first job was actually as an assistant at a big Wall Street law firm called Sullivan and Cromwell. I joined their project finance and Latin American practice groups. I'm going to be very frank, I learned very quickly that those were not the areas of legal practice that I was interested in. And so I left Sullivan and Cromwell after about 6 or 8 months. From there, I went to work for a human rights organization called Human Rights First, also based in New York City, where I focused on I was the program associate for a program that focused on human rights defenders in Guatemala, Cuba, and Colombia, as well as women's rights in the Middle East, the rights of human rights defenders in Indonesia, and a few other places. And I was at Human Rights First for about 2 years until I won Fulbright, which sent me to Madrid. And I spent a year focusing on a practice that's available in Spain called universal jurisdiction. It's the idea that sort of legal challenges for human rights violations are grounded in international law. And so jurisdiction to hold people accountable for human rights violations should be also available to many countries, really universally. So in Spain, I was there 2009, 2010, and at that time, there were several cases open under this principle of universal jurisdiction in the Spanish courts. The one that I focused on most closely was a case where a judge was taking testimony from survivors of human rights abuses during the Guatemalan Civil War. Interestingly, also, there was a judge taking testimony from people who had, from Argentinians who had survived the military junta and some of the human rights abuses there. That testimony was later, it's my understanding that that was later sent back to Argentina for legal proceedings in Argentina, addressing some of those issues, which is a very interesting sort of transnational, exchange of evidence for human rights accountability. And then I went to law school at New York University, came back to New York City for a few years. And it became very quickly apparent to me that human rights within the United States is not really something we talk about. We talk about civil rights. We sometimes, it's in the news a lot lately, we talk about reproductive rights and the rights of women. But these sort of human rights frameworks that I had spent years studying now and that, I'd learned about in places like Latin America, there's this gap in sort of applying those frameworks in the United States. And I was interested in trying to change that as a lawyer. And so, I had focused on vulnerable populations in the United States as, vulnerable populations in Latin America as an undergrad and as a Fulbright scholar, thinking about the rights of migrants, the rights of women. And so I dedicated my legal career to working with many of those same populations here in the United States. So my first legal job was representing people who'd been sentenced to death in Louisiana. I spent about that. And then I kind of shifted directions and I moved back to New York, where I represented immigrant children. This was in 2014, 2015. I don't know if you all will recall, but there was a huge surge of kids coming to the border, mostly Guatemalan, Salvadoran, and Honduran kids. And the Obama administration was pretty overwhelmed with the numbers of kids coming and instituted a really kind of shameful practice of, we called it a rocket docket, sort of even more truncated immigration proceedings for these children, making them come to court very quickly. And many of the kids ended up in New York City. And so I was part of a team of lawyers. We set out to represent as many of those kids as we could to try to make sure that they had fair and full immigration proceedings despite this rocket docket setting. So I represented those kids I did that work for about 2 years. As you can imagine, it was pretty exhausting. And so in 2017, I moved to Denver and I started a project that I'm currently directing, working with incarcerated immigrants with disabilities and medical vulnerabilities. The organization I work for has a long history of disability rights practice, and I brought my immigration perspective and my prior work with people who are incarcerated in the criminal system. And we sort of put our expertises together to start this project for people with disabilities who are incarcerated by ICE. And just to say a little bit more about that, the United States is the destination for many migrants from around the world. There is a huge flow of people from Latin America and Central America. The United States has never, in my opinion, been particularly welcoming to migrants, and our post 9/11 agencies in particular have sort of stepped up the amount of surveillance and detention for people who are migrating to the United States. There are a lot of people with disabilities in ICE custody. We're not totally sure of the exact number because it's hard to gather that data. But what we do know is that, lots of people survive trauma in their home countries, and that's why they come to the United States. Lots of people find the migration process itself disabling often, and people are also adjusting to the United States, which can also be very difficult. We also know that ICE, picks up a lot of people from the criminal legal system, so people coming out of jails and prisons who are not citizens. ICE picks them up and then begins removal proceedings against them and often detains them in ICE detention centers. And because of the disproportionate representation of people with disabilities in the criminal system, there are also then a disproportionate number of people with disabilities who are not citizens in ICE detention. So, we're dealing with a lot of people who are trauma survivors, but also people with mobility disabilities, sensory disabilities like deafness or hard of hearing. And so my practice is focusing on ensuring that their rights are respected by ICE in these detention centers. Oftentimes that means working on getting them released because the detention centers do not respect people's rights or provide them with disability accommodations. And so I've been doing that since 2017. Under the Trump administration, the number of people in ICE custody ballooned to about 55,000 people at any given day. We've never had that many people in immigration detention in this country previously. Due to COVID, that number went down, both because there were a number of lawsuits trying to force ICE to release people because detention centers are incredibly dangerous settings for the spread of COVID-19. We relied a lot on some of your Yale colleagues at the School of Public Health. Professor Greg Gonzalez gave us an expert letter, and a few other people sort of documenting the dangerousness of congregate settings like ICE detention for COVID. The United States has also been refusing to let people in at the border using something called Title 42, which is I think a CDC provision about sort of public health and the spread of infectious disease, which is another sort of very unfortunate, pretty shameful practice that the United States is engaged in. Under the Biden administration, the number of people in detention has actually gone back up. We're at about 24,000 people as of this week. And the Biden administration continues to use Title 42 at the border and also to deny release to people in the detention centers in larger numbers than we think is appropriate. So I guess the point there is that immigration issues are tricky in the United States, regardless of who is president, and that we've got a lot of work to do still to address the issues that I'm working on, sort of human rights issues in immigration in the United States. So just very quickly, I wanted to bring up two things that I think I learned studying Latin American studies at Yale that have been really relevant to me moving forward. The first, as I've touched on already, is thinking about the application of human rights frameworks to the United States. We don't talk about human rights in the United States. We talk about civil rights from the United States in the United States, but it's very clear to me after applying human rights frameworks in other countries that the United States shouldn't be exempt from those frameworks and those narratives here. And so how we treat women, how we treat migrants, how we treat incarcerated people in the United States are human rights issues. And I've oriented my career around that, focusing, like I said, on many of the same populations that I studied in Latin America here in the United States. And I've worked both with international organizations, the United Nations, and also thinking about United States domestic legal mechanisms, primarily our federal courts, trying to advance human rights narratives. The other thing I learned studying Latin American studies is really cultural competence. This is a concept we talk about a lot in the legal practices, especially in public interest law where I am, but it's not really taught at law school. At least I didn't learn it during my legal education. And to define it, according to the National Center for Cultural Competence, quote, embraces the principles of equal access and non-discriminatory practices in legal service delivery, well, really any source of service delivery, but I'm talking about legal services. And through studying other places and being in other places, I have learned, one, to recognize and be aware of my privilege and its implication. That's, whiteness, Americanness, levels of education, those sorts of things. I've also learned to know that my clients are not just the legal problems they present or the socio-political forces that have pushed them into having those legal problems. And I've finally learned that even countries whose shortcomings I have to highlight to make my case, for example, claiming that my client will not have proper mental health treatment in Mexico, should he be returned to Mexico, that those countries are vibrant, multifaceted, beautiful places, and we should honor them as such. So I'm going to stop there. I'm very happy to take questions. And thanks again for having me.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you so much, Lisa. It's such an inspiring career that you have pursued, really. Okay, so